23 billion euros. That is what Emmanuel Macron announced in Nairobi, Kenya, on May 12, 2026, standing before cameras, shaking hands, declaring a new era of partnership with Africa. Then someone read the actual contracts. Records indicate only one deal in that entire package was legally binding. One, a single signed agreement, $820 million for a port terminal in Mombasa. The rest, more than 22 billion euros, were non-binding pledges, investment intentions, the kind of language that sounds historic at a press conference and quietly evaporates when the plane lands. Burkina Faso was not there. The Alliance of Sahel States was not invited. Ibrahim Traore, the 34-year-old captain who expelled French forces and redefined what African sovereignty looks like, said nothing publicly. According to analysts who have followed his strategy, that silence was not absence, it was precision. The correct answer to a question nobody else was asking, because here is what the cameras did not show. On the same day Macron announced 23 billion euros for Africa, France still controlled the monetary policy of 14 African nations in 2026. Still, this video is the answer they hoped you would never find. Nairobi, May 11th, 2026. A continent is watching. For the first time in modern French diplomatic history, Paris chose East Africa, not its traditional Francophone West, to host a summit with the entire continent. The Africa Forward Summit, Kenya's capital. The choice alone tells you something. French President Emmanuel Macron stepped onto the stage alongside Kenyan President William Ruto, and he made a promise. 23 billion euros directed at Africa over a defined investment window. The announcement came with a headline, a handshake, and a press room full of cameras. According to France 24, the total package breaks down as 14 billion euros from French public and private sources, and 9 billion euros committed from African investors themselves. Energy, transition, digital infrastructure and artificial intelligence, maritime economy, agriculture, healthcare, those were the 5 pillars Macron named. The jobs target was 250,000, primarily in technology and green energy sectors. That number was placed front and center in the official communications. This was not a quiet bilateral. This was a continental event, marketed, staged, and delivered with full diplomatic weight. Here is what you need to hold in your mind as we go deeper. France has not held a summit of this scale on African soil since Francafrique was a household name, and the CFA-Franc debates were just beginning. The fact that Macron chose Nairobi, an Anglophone capital, outside France's traditional sphere, is the first signal that something has shifted, or is being made to look like it has. William Ruto was the perfect co-host. Kenya is an economic anchor in East Africa. Ruto's government has been building relationships with Western partners while managing significant IMF pressure at home. The optics were clean, 2 leaders, 1 stage, 1 number with 12 zeros behind it. But here is the number that the cameras did not slow down for. 23 billion euros spread across the African continent, broken across 5 sectors over multiple years, works out to a fraction of what flows the other direction through debt servicing, resource pricing, and the colonial investment architecture that has governed capital on this continent for 6 decades. Macron did not stay quiet about the leaders who have pushed back against that architecture. From Nairobi, while Mali was under active militant pressure, he made a public statement about the Alliance of Sahel States. Documents suggest his remarks were directed clearly at the military governments of Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger. According to Notre Afrique, Macron stated, "Unfortunately, current events show it was probably not the best decision Mali's authorities made for their country," referring to the decision to expel French forces. He said this from Nairobi, with cameras rolling, while the security situation in the Sahel was deteriorating in real time. The framing was deliberate. The timing was not accidental. And then, in a French-language press conference, one that the Anglophone media almost entirely missed, Macron said something that reveals the entire strategic logic of this summit. Reports reviewed show that he declared, "Nous sommes les vrais panafricanistes," We are the true Pan-Africanists. France, 23 billion euros, Pan-African. The claim was made in French. In a room without English language broadcast, no major Anglophone YouTube channel picked it up. That phrase is not a footnote. It is the thesis of what happened in Nairobi. The investment package also came with a signature deal. CMA-CGM, the French shipping giant, signed an $820 million agreement with Kenya for a deep water terminal at Mombasa port. According to reports reviewed at the summit, this is the only deal at the conference where an actual contract was executed, not just pledged. One signed contract in 5 sectors, across 23 billion euros. That detail will matter in the next part of this story, because the real question is not where the money is going, it's what the money was designed to take back. Of all 54 countries on this continent, Macron chose Kenya, a country France never colonized. No CFA franc, no French military presence, no colonial debt to leverage. That choice was not sentimental. Records indicate China Merchants Port Holdings already operates infrastructure along Kenya's Lamu corridor, and China financed the standard gauge railway running inland from Mombasa. Whoever controls that port controls the economic artery of East Africa. $820 million, one terminal, one message. And that message was not sent to Africa. What comes next will show you exactly who it was for. 23 billion euros. Say it again slowly. Let the number settle. Now ask yourself a different question, not how much, but what kind. Because there is a distinction, one that never made it into the headlines, one that the investment architecture counts on you not knowing, between a pledge and a contract, between a commitment made in front of cameras and a legal obligation enforceable in court. In diplomatic language, investment commitment carries no binding clause, no timeline, no penalty for non-delivery, no mechanism to compel disbursement. Records indicate that the majority of the 23 billion euros announced in Nairobi falls into this category. Statements of intent, frameworks for cooperation, letters of understanding, words with weight in press releases, words with no weight in a courtroom. This is not a new technique. Historically, large-scale investment announcements at France-Africa summits have carried fulfillment rates that analysts have described as, at best, partial. The architecture of announcement is itself a strategic tool. It shapes perception. It shifts headlines. It makes the responding country look like a partner rather than a creditor. It buys goodwill at the cost of a press conference rather than actual capital. And then there is CMA-CGM. The $820 million Mombasa terminal deal stands apart from everything else announced in Nairobi. Not because of its size, though that is significant, but because it is the only transaction in the entire 23 billion euro package where a contract was actually signed. According to documents reviewed from the summit, CMA-CGM, the French shipping conglomerate, entered a joint venture with the Kenyan Port Authority to develop a deep water terminal capable of receiving ultra-large container ships at Mombasa. This is a specific class of infrastructure. Ultra-large container vessels, ULCVs, require berth depths that most East African ports cannot currently accommodate. The terminal is not just a port expansion, it is a repositioning play for East African maritime logistics, and it was signed on paper with legal force. Now look at the geography. China Merchants Port Holdings already holds a stake at the Lamu Port Corridor to the north. The Chinese-built standard gauge railway, the SGR, runs from Mombasa inland to Nairobi, completed under Belt and Road Initiative financing. Documents suggest the Mombasa Deepwater Terminal was not selected at random. It is the most strategically contested logistics node on the East African coastline. The CMA-CGM deal is structurally a counter-BRI operation dressed in the language of investment partnership. France does not say this out loud. The investment architecture rarely announces its own logic. Break down the remaining sectors and a pattern becomes visible. Energy transition. The corporate partners identified in the summit materials include French energy infrastructure companies, digital and artificial intelligence. Implementation partners include French technology firms with existing African contracts. Maritime economy, CMA-CGM is already the anchor. Agriculture, French agribusiness with regional presence. Healthcare, French pharmaceutical distribution networks. Reports reviewed show that across every sector, the capital does not simply flow into African economies. It flows through French corporate contractors and returns in the form of profits, fees, and service contracts back to France. This is what the investment architecture is designed to do. The money moves in a circle. Africa receives the infrastructure. France retains the margin. Burkina Faso is not in this equation, not as a recipient, not as a partner. The AES alliance, Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger, has explicitly rejected this model of conditioned financing. The strategic logic that Ibrahim Traore has articulated is precisely this, that investment tied to French corporate structures is not investment. It is a revenue capture mechanism with a ribbon on it. Documents suggest that Traore's position is not ideological refusal. It is pattern recognition. He has read the history. He understands what the terms mean before the ink dries. France-Africa summits have promised transformation before. The language changes, the amounts change, the logos on the banners change, the structure does not. And that structure is what 23 billion euros actually represents. Not a gift, not a partnership, an architecture built over decades, maintained through debt, expanded through infrastructure that African nations will pay to use, at rates set by the companies that built it for the next 30 years. The pledges will not all materialize. The signed contract will. And what it secures, a terminal, a lane, a logistics node, will compound in ways that no press release will ever fully explain. Because the question was never where the money is going. The question is what the money was designed to take back. And there was one name Macron never said at the summit, one country, one leader. That omission was deliberate. $820 million. One signed contract out of 23 billion euros. Records indicate every other commitment announced in Nairobi was a non-binding pledge. No legal liability, no delivery timeline, no consequence for non-fulfillment. Investment language built to generate headlines, not obligations. That single contract is for a port terminal, facing an ocean that China has been quietly dominating for a decade. The rest of the 23 billion. It is language. What that language is designed to do next changes everything. They were not there. Not because they chose to stay away, not because they missed the invitation. Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger, the three nations forming the Alliance of Sahel States, were absent from Nairobi because the architecture of the summit itself made their presence impossible. Reports reviewed show that the French delegation framed this as self-exclusion, pointing to the AES bloc's distance from ECOWAS frameworks. But the AES formally departed ECOWAS in January of 2025. They were not inside the framework through which invitations moved. The absence was structural. And structures, as we have seen with 23 billion euros, rarely happen by accident. This was exclusion dressed as procedural fact. The summit invited partners. The AES were not defined as partners. They were defined implicitly as the problem the summit was responding to. And from that stage in Nairobi, Macron spoke about them anyway. He was asked about Mali, about the security situation deteriorating in the north, about armed groups pressing against civilian populations, while the Malian transitional government, without French forces, attempted to hold the line. Records indicate that Macron's response carried a particular weight. He said, "Unfortunately, current events show it was probably not the best decision Mali's authorities made for their country." He was referring to the expulsion of French troops. A head of state, standing on a stage in Kenya, at a continent-wide investment summit, looked at a country experiencing active armed conflict and used that conflict as proof that the country should not have removed his soldiers. Documents suggest this was not geopolitical commentary. This was a public taunt, delivered at the precise moment it would cause the most damage, from the precise distance that offered the most safety. Mali's Prime Minister Choguel Maiga did not let it stand. According to reports from La Nouvelle Tribune, Maiga issued a formal rebuttal. His position was direct. France had not completed its security mandate. The Malian government did not remove French forces on a whim. It removed them because the mission had failed, and France had used that mission as leverage, not as service. MAGA's account and Macron's account cannot both be true. Meanwhile, Burkina Faso said nothing officially. Ibrahim Traore issued no statement about the Nairobi summit, no press release, no formal diplomatic response. Analysts who have followed his strategy closely do not read this as absence of awareness. They read it as the opposite. Traoré understands a principle many leaders have spent careers failing to grasp. If your opponent wants you in the conversation, the most powerful move is to refuse the room entirely. A formal response would have handed Macron exactly what the summit was partly designed to generate: a debate about whether 23 billion euros was a good deal, whether the terms were fair, whether Africa should accept this partnership or that one. That debate happens inside a framework that assumes the framework is legitimate. Traoré's silence is a rejection of the premise, not the offer, the premise. Documents suggest this is consistent with everything Burkina Faso has done since 2022. The expulsion of foreign NGOs without full transparency agreements, the renegotiation of external creditor terms, the refusal of conditional aid packages. Each move says the same thing in a different language. We are not asking for your permission to govern ourselves. The silence at Nairobi said it again. And the fact that you are still watching, that you have made it this far, means you already understand something most people following the Nairobi summit coverage will never be told. The summit was not just an economic event. It was a narrative event, designed to produce a specific image: France standing with Africa, investing in Africa's future. The countries absent from that image were absent by design. Now return to the phrase Macron used before the cameras. Remember it. Nous sommes les vrais panafricanistes. We are the true Pan-Africanists. The man who said this presided over a summit that excluded the governments most actively practicing Pan-Africanism on the continent. Burkina Faso has pursued monetary sovereignty. Burkina Faso has declined infrastructure deals whose terms it did not control. The Alliance of Sahel States has built a mutual defense and economic structure independent of the frameworks Paris helped design. These are not words about Pan-Africanism. These are acts. The France-Africa Investment Summit produced words. It produced one signed contract worth $820 million for a French shipping corporation. It produced non-binding, unscheduled pledges totaling the rest of a 23 billion euro headline. And it produced a press conference in which a European head of state declared himself the authentic voice of an African political philosophy. The governments living that philosophy were not invited. According to analysts tracking post-ICAO's Sahel dynamics, this is not a coincidence of logistics. This is the colonial investment framework made visible. The framework does not extend partnership to those who have decided they do not need it. It extends partnership to those who remain inside the system it was built to sustain. To invite the AS would have been to acknowledge them as equals, and equals at the table renegotiate the terms. So they were not invited, and their absence was used as evidence against them. That is the architecture of the summit, stripped of its ribbon. Because if France is truly Africa's partner, then why does it still hold the master key to 14 nations' treasuries? At the Nairobi closing press conference, Macron said 5 words almost no English language outlet reported. Nous sommes les vrais panafricanistes. We are the true Pan-Africanists. Records indicate France still controls the monetary reserves of 14 African nations in 2026. The ECO currency transition, promised by Macron himself in 2019, has not happened. 7 years. Not a single nation has gained full monetary sovereignty under the reformed framework. That is not partnership. That is the definition of the system we are about to name. That question has an answer, and the answer has a name. The CFA franc was created in 1945, not by African governments, by France. The name itself has changed over the decades, from Colonies Françaises d'Afrique to Communauté Financière Africaine. But the architecture beneath the name has not changed in any way that matters to the people living inside it. 14 nations, approximately 180 million people, all bound to a currency pegged first to the French franc And then, when France adopted the euro, pegged to the euro instead, the switch happened automatically. No African government voted on it. Today, 2 central banks manage the CFA franc system. The BCEAO covers 8 West African nations. The BEAC covers 6 Central African nations. Both operate under frameworks France helped design and that France continues to guarantee. The guarantee is the mechanism. When a guarantor exists, the guaranteed party has already transferred something invisible, the final authority over its own monetary stability. Records indicate that in 2020, France announced a reform. The requirement for CFA zone countries to deposit 50% of their foreign exchange reserves at the Banque de France would end. The optics shifted, but the peg to the euro remained. France's role as exchange rate guarantor remained. The governance architecture remained. According to analysts cited in Foreign Policy, the reforms reduced the visibility of French control without reducing the substance of it. A currency peg to the euro means 14 African governments cannot devalue their currencies to make exports more competitive. They cannot expand their money supply to respond to a domestic shock. They cannot set independent interest rates calibrated to their own economic cycles. Every tool that modern monetary policy depends on, the tools the United States used in 2008, that the European Central Bank reached for in 2020, those tools do not exist for CFA zone governments. They were surrendered at the door. What they receive in exchange is described as stability. Stability is real. Inflation in CFA zone countries has historically been lower than in non-CFA neighbors. But stability for whom and toward what purpose? The fixed exchange rate was designed to facilitate trade with the Eurozone. It was not designed to accelerate industrial development in Ouagadougou or Bamako. Stability that serves the colonial investment framework is not a neutral gift. It is a feature. Now hold that against the announcement made at Nairobi. On the same day, France-Africa diplomacy produced its 23 billion euro headline. One signed contract, the rest in promises. The CFA franc remained pegged to the euro. The ECO, the currency meant to replace the CFA franc for 8 WMU nations, remained unborn. Macron and Alassane Ouattara announced the ECO at Abidjan in December of 2019. 7 years later, not one country has made the transition. France remains the guarantor. Guarantors do not surrender leverage voluntarily. 23 billion euros in investment, $0 in monetary sovereignty return. Burkina Faso, alongside Mali and Niger inside the Alliance of Sahel States, has moved differently. The AES bloc has engaged in serious internal discussions about exiting the CFA franc zone entirely. Reports reviewed show that alternatives under consideration include a shared AES currency and a gold-backed monetary instrument. Significant given that Burkina Faso and Mali are among West Africa's largest gold producers. When Ibrahim Traore speaks about reclaiming economic sovereignty, this is not a speech. It is a policy under construction. The colonial investment framework does not hold Africa with chains. It holds Africa with architecture. The architecture of a currency you did not design, pegged to a bloc whose interests are not yours, guaranteed by a country that calls itself your partner. 23 billion euros announced, monetary sovereignty still offshore. France-Africa partnership. The word partnership appears on every press release. It does not appear in the balance sheet. 23 billion euros, one signed contract worth $820 million. Language dressed as money, a press release dressed as a summit. The Alliance of Sahel States was not invited to Nairobi. The men actually building Pan-African alternatives were excluded by the man declaring himself a true Pan-Africanist. And 14 nations still wake up every morning with a currency they did not design, pegged to a bloc whose interests are not theirs, guaranteed by the country throwing the party. This is what 23 billion euros actually means. This is what Pan-Africanism actually looks like. This is what partnership actually costs. Ibrahim Traore did not send a delegation to Nairobi. He did not issue a counterstatement. He did not debate the number. He refused to play by the rules of a game designed to produce a specific outcome. That is not weakness. That is the most precise form of strategic clarity available to a leader who understands the architecture he is refusing. When Burkina Faso declines to participate in a framework built to manage Africa rather than empower it, that refusal is not personal. It is a signal to the entire continent. It says the terms are not acceptable. It says sovereignty is not something you request from the guarantor. It is something you build while they are still holding the press conference. If you watched this far and you believe that number was real, hit like. Because the point of this video was not to make you angry. It was to make you precise. Anger fades. Precision stays. If you now know the difference between an announcement and a commitment, between a pledge and a transfer, that is the thing worth pressing. Share this with one person who still thinks Europe is investing in Africa's future. Share it with anyone who heard 23 billion and felt relief. They deserve to know what the balance sheet actually says. In the comments, drop 3 things. The words, empty promise, your country, and one specific thing this video changed in how you see French investment in Africa. Not a feeling, one concrete thing. We read every comment. What you write there shapes what we cover next. There's another video waiting on this channel. The story of how 14 nations came to hold a currency printed in France. That history goes back decades before any summit or press release. It explains why the number is always large and the transfer is always small. It is the foundation beneath everything you watch today. It is on this channel. Find it.